Hello class, this is Mr. Biddle and welcome back. For today's digital input, we will be discussing the impact of urbanization. Now previously, we've explored the first settlements and the shift from Paleolithic hunter-gathering to Neolithic farming. We've also discussed how farming led to the first great civilizations, like Sumer. And now for today's lesson, we'll be exploring how civilized living led to a cultural shift in the way people lived their lives. Indeed, people in the Near East became more than just civilized, now they were becoming urbanized. So let's begin with an overview of today's lecture. First, we will define urbanization and explore why cities became so popular in the first place. Then we will talk about some of the benefits, the positives, of living in a city in the ancient Near East. But then we'll also talk about some of the challenges and the negative effects of living in a highly populated urban area. So what is urbanization? In short, urbanization is a term used to describe the rapid growth of cities. Think of it this way. Urban basically refers to the city, whereas rural refers to the countryside. Moreover, urbanization is also a term used to explain a shift from rural culture, farming culture, to urban culture, which is basically city culture. So in regards to rural culture, individuals who lived on the farms in the ancient Near East spent most of their lives simply irrigating, planting, and harvesting crops, day in and day out. For many ancient people in Mesopotamia, this rural culture wasn't all that appealing. Frankly, there were many drawbacks. First, farming was back-breaking work. Second, droughts and floods still made life very unpredictable and often quite dangerous. And did I mention that nomadic clans would often raid these outlying villages and farms as well? You see, obviously, living on a farm had inherent dangers. Furthermore, if an individual needed specialized goods or services, they would need to travel far and wide to get them. Thus, people in the Near East began to move away from this rural way of life and toward the cities. Now, not surprising, it wasn't too long before a massive migration took place. The people living in the villages moved to the city in hopes of improving their daily life. Soon thereafter, these ancient cities would become the centers of power and prosperity. So now that we know a little about the cause of urbanization, what were some of the effects? Let's explore some of the benefits and the challenges of city life. One obvious benefit of living in a large city was the inherent safety they provided. You see, most cities had built walls around the perimeter to keep out nomadic invaders and floods. Within the city, the homes were quite sturdy, made of stone, wood, or sun-dried brick. Even more, the homes became more sophisticated, some were even 2 stories high. Consequently, feeling more secure made having a larger family seem more practical. So not only were people migrating to the new cities, but the people living within these cities were having more children than ever before. Another benefit to living in a city was nearby access to bazaars and markets. Yes, trade flourished in these urban centers. Compared to the rural outlying settlements, the city offered people way more opportunities to barter for goods and services. Merchants could become quite wealthy living in the cities. Eventually, they would become masters of business, utilizing a new economic model known as supply and demand to maintain their wealth. Now, what does supply and demand mean? Well, for example, some products like cedar or bronze were more prized than, say, a clay pot because cedar was quite rare and bronze required tremendous skill to craft. A limited supply of quality products creates a very high demand. Also, another benefit, because trade flourished, having a highly specialized and highly skilled labor force became essential. Defined, specialization simply means that individuals became experts in different types of jobs. A more specialized labor force gave individuals in the city more opportunity to prosper. One such specialized job in the ancient Near East was metalworking. Actually, the first metals used in the ancient world were copper and tin. However, neither were all that durable. Around 3000 BCE, these crafty metalworkers discovered that smelting or combining copper and tin together created a new, more durable metal known as bronze. Yes, this bronze would usher in new advances in farming, transportation, and especially warfare. Furthermore, bronze would help to ensure that cities would remain the centers of power and prosperity, all thanks to specialized labor. As previously stated, someone who lived in the city had a greater chance of achieving economic prosperity. For the most part, a farmer in a rural village didn't have the same earning power as, say, a merchant or a scribe. Urbanization gave humanity more opportunity to achieve wealth and social mobility. This idea of rags to riches really began in the ancient city-states of Mesopotamia. Undoubtedly, this promise is still alive in our world today, thousands of years later. Unfortunately, urbanization had its challenges as well. First, living in a dense community with domesticated animals wasn't the most sanitary. Specifically, living in proximity with animals created new diseases like the bubonic plague, smallpox, and tuberculosis. To make matters even worse, people who lived in the cities were in constant contact with each other, which helped to spread disease and illness like gangbusters. In short, living in an early city was like living sort of in a toxic petri dish. Also, the concept of land ownership really began to complicate our world. Simply possessing and protecting land were both relatively new concepts in human history. Conflict among city-states were quite common because protecting territory and resources was the only way to ensure the survival of the city itself. Sadly, the history of the ancient Near East is marred in bloodshed. To complicate matters even further, urbanization meant that cities had more mouths to feed than ever before. Over time, the population became too large to sustain with local resources alone. Thus, with resources becoming more and more sparse, conflict became an inevitability. Soon, the larger, more populous city-states began to attack and swallow up smaller territories in order to gain control of their water and farmland. These conflicts would eventually lead to all-out warfare between several different city-states. And if war and disease weren't bad enough, there was also the threat of starvation. Yes, poverty was a real concern. For the lower-class people living in the city, as we discussed earlier, trade and specialized labor created a brand new economy with haves and have-nots. And trust me, you did not want to be a have-not. Oftentimes, impoverished people living in the cities were relegated to servitude, sometimes even being forced into slavery to pay off their debts. It was a miserable existence with very little chance for future prosperity, or a full belly. In all, most people living in the cities worked longer hours under harsher conditions than those who lived in the rural settlements or farms. Which leads us to our final point, social inequality. Now, before the dawn of civilization and the growth of urbanization, humanity was much more egalitarian, which you guys remember means equal. Men and women really shared power more evenly. Now, with the growth of city-states and cities, this allowed men to gain more power than ever before. Being a woman in the civilized world meant you had very little chance of achieving the same kind of wealth that a man could. Merchants, scribes, and metal workers. These were all male-dominated professions that were potentially quite profitable. Women who lived in the city were simply not given the same training that men received. Female jobs were still primarily focused on maintaining the home. Worst of all, the agricultural revolution was indirectly responsible for slavery. Typically, most slaves in the Near East were prisoners of war, but as we mentioned earlier, some people would voluntarily become slaves to pay off debts and feed their families. Humans could now own other humans to make a profit. Now, wealthy people in power would do anything to maintain their power, including the exploitation and enslavement of their own fellow man and woman. In all, urbanization really fueled our greed in many, many ways. So let's review. First, we defined urbanization and why rural life failed to meet the needs of many people in the ancient Near East. Then we discussed the benefits of urban life, namely living in a large city provided individuals with an increased sense of security, access to bazaars, opportunities for different types of jobs, and hope for future prosperity. Consequently, we also examined the negative impact of urbanization, and this included the spread of diseases, inequality, and just all-out war. As you can see, urbanization in the Near East served as a template for our world. Today, civilized cities often require very uncivilized behavior to maintain them. Indeed, the great achievements of our ancestors came at a great human cost. So this about wraps it up for today. Next time we will discuss how the rapid growth of cities led to the world's first empires. Remember, this is just one chapter of the most amazing story ever told, our story. Until next time.